Welcome back to another Thunder Road Running podcast. Our guest today is strength and conditioning coach Jason Hettler of HettlerPerformance.com and also of ALTIS. You can see right there rocking the ALTIS gear. For those of y'all that aren't familiar with ALTIS, it's a pro training group out in Phoenix, Arizona. They do coaches education as well as work with some of the most elite athletes in the world on the track, and then in a couple other strength and power sports as well. So things like bobsled, maybe a couple MLB players, right? Y'all kind of dabble in a lot of different things.
Yeah, there's a lot of baseball here, and it's a pretty international group. So we get some rugby and some AFL that'll come out for a few weeks at a time.
Awesome. Yeah, so a really awesome thing. We'll get into ALTIS here in a second, but Jason comes with experience, a bachelor's in exercise science. He worked at Western Michigan University within the Olympic sport department there as a strength and conditioning coach. Then he was a member of the greatest intern group ALTIS has ever seen. And I want to say it was 2014, the summer of 2014, something like that. Jason and I interned at ALTIS together, along with a couple other of our buddies. And I know we all got our hair blown back by how much we were learning that summer. I think the only difference is that I left the internship without a job, with everything packed into a Kia Forte, and Jason landed a full-time gig. So screw you, man, for that. And then since he started working with ALTIS, he's done stints with a lot of different people, working with governing bodies as well as Olympic teams. So he's worked worked within speed and strength development with Canada, with the Chinese Athletic Association, and within Major League Baseball, like we just said. Most recently, he's been working on the education side of ALTIS, the educational branch, doing presentations, leading a couple of podcasts that I've heard as well. So kind of, helping them branch out into other areas. And so for you coaches out there tuning in, go check out HettlerPerformance.com. He's got a lot of articles, practical explanations, video explanations of lifts and things like that, a lot of different training ideas as well. And then also go check out the ALTIS Coaches Education. It ain't cheap, but it's worth your money. I can promise you that. So Jason, thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, dude, of course. I think about, that summer we had together back there and at ALTIS together with Gareth Sanford, who's now gone on to do some really big things regarding research in the speed, anaerobic speed reserve space, and has really made a name for himself. And you're making a name for yourself. We all kind of branched out into our separate ways. And dude, what an elite environment ALTIS was. Like, I left there a different coach, seriously. And then you got to start there. Like, you really got to sink your teeth in, and you've been around it for several years now. What was it like? I mean, just jumping right in, to something on that level.
Yeah, it was overwhelming for sure, but also, humbling and exciting. It was just so many different things.
Yeah.
I think back to really you, me, and Gareth, as you mentioned, a lot of conversations between the three of us, and sometimes we branch off and whatever. We were all looking for what was next after that internship. So, when they offered the full-time job, it was, I say it was more of a part-time job really that first year. There wasn't a lot of money involved, and so there's a lot of personal training on the side and stuff. But as soon as it came with that offer, I knew that was it. Like you said, we learned so much just in the 7 or 8 weeks that we were there. And I knew that there was so much more to learn. You're there we were there leading into the competitive season. And so it was awesome to see that side of things. But it just made me wonder, like, what are these guys doing in the fall? What are they doing in the winter? What do they do to get to this point? And then how do they finish out the season? And so right away, I knew I wanted to come back and kind of visit and hang out a little bit to try to get a better idea of the full picture. Mm-hmm. So when they offered the position, I thought, well, this is perfect, because I'll be able to do that and I'll make a little bit of money for it and learn a whole lot more.
Yeah.
And, but there was also, the challenge was kind of new into track and field with some really high level coaches and athletes. I'll be honest, the first year or two, I went through some phases where I was like, man, I might not be cut out for this. Because I'm seeing these athletes move on the track, for instance, and I think they all look phenomenal, like perfect. But I'm saying coaches who are just picking it apart, seeing all these
Yeah.
flaws. They just have such a good eye for the movement. And it took me such a long time to get anywhere close to that. Not that I'm close to that, but to get to the point where I can really see that movement in real time and understand what elite sprint mechanics look like. And because that was taking so long, and because I was in that environment, there was times where, I kind of had to talk myself into it and give myself a little pep talk that I was going to make it and it was going to be all right. And
Yeah.
I think that was great, for my experience and to understand that this was something that I really wanted to pursue wholeheartedly and try to understand and be good at ultimately.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, not having that, a ton of sprint background coming in, just understanding kind of the basics of human performance. And then, boom, all of a sudden, all that information, all the reading, all the studying and mentoring, I mean, for people that are tuning in, listening right now that aren't familiar, I'll give you a very brief thing, but just imagine a track practice with world record holder talent, world elite coaches. So whoever the best in the world is, just consider them one of the top 3. And then you've maybe got 6 or 7 training tables lining the outside of the track where you've got different therapists waiting to work on these athletes. And then you've got a world-class gym where you go and watch these world record holders, go lift after they work out on the track. And so it's like this perfect little mixture of all these environments combined into one. And if you can imagine, he just kind of explained what it was like jumping into the fire, so to speak. It was a lot, I'm sure, and still very cool, and I'm jealous of all the people you got to talk to, or you got to talk to and mingle with during your time there. Like, Dan and Stu and Andreas and Kevin and all those guys, all the poolside chats you got to listen into. I mean, that stuff is priceless, man. That stuff is priceless.
You mentioned the poolside chat and that's part of the education event. So ultimately, my continuing education, instead of having to, I should say having to, because there's pros to that as well, but we'll say having to, instead of having to come out of pocket and fly to the East Coast to go to a conference or a seminar, I'm so fortunate that it all lands in my backyard. And most of that is through ALTIS, but also through Exos, who we partner with for the weight room. There's a huge emphasis on education. And with the elite nature of it, there's a lot of visitors who want to stop by and kind of see what's going on. And so I've just been able to meet and talk to so many people. And it's always insightful and always humbling. And it really helps that continued drive, keep the flame burning, I guess.
Yeah, to keep learning and getting better, of course. What, within all these people, all these elite people, because I think elite coaches and elite athletes, can have a lot in common at times. There's a reason why they got to where they are. Yes, they have talent, but if they've been at the top of the stage, the world stage for several years, they're probably doing some things right too. Did you start to see any commonalities between these elite athletes you got to work with on a daily basis?
It's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer because I kind of waver on it a lot, because there's kind of a mixture, different things, different character traits maybe that make different individuals successful. Mm-hmm. So some will be, borderline OCD in terms of video review and journaling and those types of things, and that's what works for them. Mm-hmm. And then some will be like ignorance is bliss type of thing, where they're just really good at what they do, and they come in and they show up and they do it. And from an outside perspective, at times, maybe it appears that they're not as quote unquote professional, or maybe don't take it as serious is probably a good kind of term for it. Mm-hmm. But once you get to know these people, you realize they can't and they shouldn't take it that serious, because if they do, then it starts to crumble and fall apart. And that's just what works for them and their own unique personality and their own unique chemistry. And so, yes, there's some commonalities and there's a lot of differences. And I think some of it comes from how international the groups that I've worked with have been, from the Chinese Athletics Association to just the group at ALTIS with Caribbean athletes, North American athletes, European, from all corners of the globe. And not that there's necessarily commonalities amongst those different geographical regions, but you just start to see all these different people who are successful for their own kind of unique reasons. But
Yeah.
track and field, the commonality that I think I have found is that they love the sport, and it's maybe it seems obvious if you think about it, because there's not a lot of money in it. It's not like they're doing it for the fame and the fortune. They're doing it because they love the sport, and they're driven for really small increments of improvement. And I'd say that's a pretty kind of overarching, sweeping theme amongst a lot of them.
Dude, that's so powerful though. It seems simple, but like right now I work with a lot of developmental athletes, a lot of guys in that high school, college, post-collegiate space. And what you find working with young athletes is that their sources of motivation kind of go through phases. Maybe when they first start, it's very external, right? They like the pat on the back. They like to feel like they're a part of something. Their friends run, whatever it might be. And then it transitions into, hey, I got my name in the paper, and then all of a sudden they're doing it for, a little bit of notoriety or whatever, but I tell you what, that transition from high school to college and then from college to pros, at some point, if you don't love what you're doing, like you're saying, loving that sport, like it just doesn't last long. You know what I mean? It has to come from within. You have to love what you're doing. You have to find the love in what you're doing if you haven't found it yet. And so I wouldn't undersell that if that's the commonality, but I love the insight into the different personalities. Cause I for sure coached the jock, the football player, that was like, coach, you handle the metrics. I don't want to know about all that. Just tell me what to do,
I think it's really important to make an attempt to identify those differences early on, or at least, at some point. Andre DeGrasse comes to mind. At least when he was with us, it was right after transitioning out of college. And he didn't really need to know a lot of the details. He needed a sound training program put together, and he needed to show up and execute it. And then he would show up to a competition and he would execute that. Not that there wasn't, more behind the scenes and more to it, but from a simplistic standpoint, that was it.
So that's awesome, man. The difference is as far as the person goes. And then, that tells me a lot about your philosophy, approaching strength training for athletes as well. Just the idea that, hey, I approach it, as an individual. What does the individual need and how do they need it presented, and I feel like that's an important piece too, wouldn't you say?
Totally. And that was something, it was probably one of the big top 2 or 3 things that were kind of drilled into myself or us, during that internship, and something that I'm really grateful for. Another one would be just the amount of attention that you pay during the warm up and as the athletes are really doing anything. I think it's kind of those 2 things that have always really stood out to me that I'm really grateful for understanding the importance of really early on in my career, because I think it goes a long way. And it also, it helps that it plays to my strengths. I think, I think that my strength as a coach is the ability to relate to people and connect with people and a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and kind of adaptable in that sense. And so with that, kind of having that individualized sort of approach or philosophy, it's just what works for me. Some people will have a lot of success with a more kind of general approach for everybody that's really well laid out and really well executed and put together and elicits results. But I work a little bit more, I guess, on the individual side, and having the international group of, anywhere from 20 years old to 32 years old for most of them, some language barriers, cultural traditions, things like that. It almost forces you kind of down that path, which, like I said, is just what works for me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, when you get to that level, it's like, if you're not training the individual, what are you doing? I mean, somebody like Andre DeGrasse or Aries Merritt, like, there's a reason they are who they are. Like, you got to feed them a certain type, of work. So that's kind of blows my mind to think about working with those guys in the weight room. Actually, it must have been fun. How is like coming in, kind of working in a kind of a more generic Olympics environment, at a Western there. where you were at, and then diving into this really individualized, Olympic level scene. How has your perspective shifted over the years? I mean, or what's the biggest thing that shifted, in your personal beliefs during your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll apologize because I'm going to I don't know, I'm going to kind of pull this trick where I don't know if I actually answer the question, but
Okay,
I'll roll with what comes to mind. And
okay.
when I think about coming from the collegiate setting into this setting,
yeah,
two really come to mind initially. And one was, Western Michigan is a Division I university. I got there and I thought, these athletes are pretty good. They move pretty good. They're strong and all these things. And then I got to ALTIS, and I remember the very first day, really still to this day, I'll be at the track and I'll just catch myself kind of staring, not really actually paying attention, just in awe sort of what these athletes are capable of doing any given day on any given workout. Like it's really impressive. And sometimes I take it for granted, and then sometimes it really hits me like a ton of bricks. But early days, I wasn't really expecting, I was naive. I didn't know that there was going to be such a difference between the level of those athletes. And it was huge. The other thing, in the collegiate setting, it's messy from a sense of athletic directors, sport coaches, S&C coaches, athletic trainers. Sometimes some of the athletes will have their own individual person within the city that they're in that they hang on to or like to work with and things like that. There's a lot more politics and bureaucracy. And so it was really sort of refreshing to come into a private training center ultimately, and just the amount of control and freedom that you have. Not that the collegiate setting isn't driven by the performance of the athletes, but there's so many other things that get involved. And it's a hard thing to figure out. And so having the freedom that a private center or doing your own thing provides, I think is really interesting and cool. And so trying to tie it into the question, as much as it's unfortunate, I think you kind of need to factor those things in. Like, what are the constraints and logistics of the environment you're in? And how does that shape your philosophy for how you train or what your approach is? Probably both as an athlete and as a coach, from a sense of how do you keep yourself healthy? How do you take control of your own outcomes? From an athlete perspective, I think it's important that they look at their career as their job and approach it as they would a job interview, and, showing up 9 to 5 and being on time and getting things done and listening to your superiors and, all those things. So whatever you want to use to describe it. And it also, within that setting, a lot of it is centered around a team. And so it's a little bit harder to individualize. Times are a little bit more constricting in terms of what times you have access to facilities or what time you can have in-person, face-to-face, access. And so all these things will affect your program in one way or another in terms of what you try to fit in and what you don't. And then you get total freedom on the back end of that. And it's liberating, but it's also overwhelming because you can quite literally do whatever you want, almost whenever you want. So I think it forces them to just think a little bit differently. Not that it's better or worse per se, but really try to be critical of what you're doing and when and how you want to lay elements together in terms of strength training and speed training, and you have a gap in between them. So I really haven't answered your question. And it's
I think you have. I think you have. And I'm trying to figure out a way to word it, man, because I hear you. I always used to tell people, like, the difference between working with the pro and college is like when you're in college, you have to work within boxes. There are these little windows of time. There are these boxes. There are rules. There are things that force your hand as far as what you can do. And you have to really decide what's important to you because the amount of time you have is so limited. You know what I mean? And so you learn to get creative within the box. Whereas, like you're saying, within the center, like, there are no boxes. The cuffs are off, man. The gloves are off, so to speak. It's like, how far do we want to take this? How creative do we want to get with our time and with these athletes, you know? So sounds like your perspective has shifted as far as the possibilities, a little bit, you know, with a little more freedom with the athletes too, maybe. I don't know if I'm off the mark there.
Very much.
Yeah.
Very much. I think what it allows is time to experiment in a very kind of and sort of controlled way. But you know, I'll probably keep coming back to this idea of just trying to figure out this performance puzzle. And so for me, it's a lot of trial and error, and it's that freedom really allows some of that experimentation to try to determine what works. And so I think, you know, if I were to try to directly answer your question, whereas previously it would have been a little bit more maybe cookie cutter or kind of structured and laid out, now it's trying to blend a lot of different things, but doing so from a standpoint of still being capable of trying to understand what's working and what's not, and what's having the desired effect and what isn't. So not just throwing the kitchen sink at it, but manipulating a lot of different variables, keeping some staples into the programming, and trying to paint a better picture.
Gotcha. So moving into the endurance stuff. All right. So recently you've dove into the endurance world, working with a couple triathletes and doing some work there, some really good work. And I know that you've dove in deep, and you've really invested a lot of time and just been researching and reading, and I've been just antsy to pick your brain. You know what I mean? Because I've never coached a triathlete. I've coached triathletes turned runner, so I have a little bit of an idea of what you get walking through the door, but never done, you know, programming in the weight room. So I'd hate to ask you a general question, because it's just tough to answer sometimes, but like, you know, with the triathletes you've come across, with the endurance athletes you've come across, and these are high level people, these are people on the world stage now. We're not talking, you know, your hobbyist. What have been the biggest areas of opportunity with those guys you've seen in the weight room?
I'd say, if you don't mind, I'll take it. Well, I'll preface it with the work that I've been doing within the triathlon world is kind of a mix of sort of movement based. So we've been doing quite a bit on the field.
Okay.
And so I mentioned that because, I mean, that's it. Those are, I think, the really two big areas. And part of it specific to triathlon is the inclusion of a mixed team relay that they now have. So shorter distances, 2 men, 2 women compete, and it's a part of the Olympics now. So it's definitely on the radar of a lot of federations and governing bodies. But, you know, as I'm sure there's a lot of kind of traditions in terms of viewpoints on strength training for endurance. And it usually stems from this idea of, oh, we should be specific, work on muscular endurance, you know, 3 sets of 20 reps, body weight or low load. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'll say that's great for somebody like me, because it allows me to come into a group of elite athletes that have a pretty low training age in terms of the weight room. They may have a very high training age in terms of everything else that they're doing. And a lot of them do and will and kind of need that. But it just, there's this huge door to just be broken into in terms of these performance improvements. And I say performance, but I should probably backtrack. And maybe it's injury prevention. Maybe, you know, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's movement quality, movement expression. It's transferring some strength and power into what they're able to do. For me, a lot of it is centered around the run. And that's kind of why they approached myself and ALTIS to get some work done, because of our history of running and sprinting. But like, it's really more in line of max strength, power output, and then how they move in something a little bit more dynamic and explosive. I think what often gets lost within something like an Olympic distance triathlon that'll take 2 hours roughly to complete, kind of middle ground between men and women. On the bike, you know, they'll have upwards of 30 to 40 instances where they're over 600 watts on the bike, which is a lot. You know, there's a lot of intense bursts. There's a lot of correlation between whoever's first at 200 meters into the swim, into a 1500 meter swim, and who gets on the podium. There's a lot of sprint finishes. And while, you know, there's also a lot of kind of steady state and longer, slower activity, this intensity is mixed in. as well as this high training load. And so if we can bring in some elements through strength and power training or movement training on the field and plyometrics and things like that, that is away from kind of the usual movement patterns and the loads that they'll exhibit or experience, I think it opens a lot of doors for a number of different areas.
Yeah.
Maybe a general.
It's exciting. It's exciting. I mean, essentially you're getting what kind of sounds like a bit of a blank slate in the weight room, except you've got an Olympic caliber athlete.
It's a beautiful thing, really, because they know what it takes to be elite and professional, and they have the mindset, they have the approach, they have all the right motivations. And then there's this huge gap with this low training age.
That's so cool. That's so cool.
And then with, a lot of differences between the strength and power athletes. So there's a good paper about the mundanity of excellence. And I kind of come back to it because with some of the sprinters, you sort of throw in a little bit more variability in terms of exercise selection and what they're doing to keep their attention and to keep them engaged and interested. But you really don't need to do that with the endurance crowd, because they will just try to perfect whatever it is, and just small improvements in the load goes a really long way. And so for me, I really enjoy both approaches. And so it's really cool to be able to work on both sides of it and kind of see the differences and see what works, and then start to incorporate what I like with the sprint population with the endurance and vice versa. I think it's allowed me over the last couple of years to, I think, develop a little bit more of a holistic philosophy and a better understanding of what can be accomplished and how and what I'm trying to accomplish and those types of things.
Yeah. All right. So I got a two-parter for you. All right. This is my last one. First part is, what metrics are you using to grade yourself as a strength coach with these endurance athletes? Second, how strong is strong enough for an endurance athlete? It's a two-parter. What metrics create an A+ report for a strength coach? Two, how strong is strong enough?
That's big ones. Those are great questions. So for the first one, I grade myself. So right now this group, it's been a weird year, obviously. But for example, they're over 30 hours a week of training. And that includes 3 hours of kind of strength and power type stuff, but they're doing some really heavy blocks on the bike. They're in a really heavy endurance block right now. And, so with that group, I kind of grade myself with what can I get done that has zero negative interference on what else they have to get done. The really specific, arguably more important stuff. Mm-hmm. And that may, change during the different times of the year. But right now they're prioritizing this endurance block. And so for me, I grade myself on how well can they execute their other sessions, swim, bike, and run, around the stuff that we're doing. And so that's been huge for me early on. But I think that it's at a point where I need to figure out a better way. I think not that we've got that perfected, but now that I have a better understanding of it and of the endurance world in general and how strength and power fits, as well as the group specifically and how the head coach operates, individual athletes that make up the group, I'm definitely at a point, I would say, that I need to come up with some better metrics to gauge it. And it's along these lines of, are they getting stronger in the weight room? Are they able to exhibit that through some of the slightly more intense runs that they're doing? Are they able to handle some of the plyometrics that I would maybe want to give them? So it's definitely something I need to get some more thought to going forward, but that's kind of what it's been in the past.
Yeah. Well, I think what you said is, perfect in a way. It's like, hey, these are a bunch of individuals at a high level, and I'm just getting to the point where I know them and I kind of understand their limitations. So you can, sounds like you're on track with that, figuring that out. It'll be interesting to check back in with you in 10 or 12 weeks, to see what all the different directions these guys are going, so.
Yeah. And it'll be great to get them back face to face. We've been doing a lot, three days a week on Zoom. And so, you just kind of roll with it. And pros and cons. They've been it's been the most consistent they've been with this type of training, probably ever really in their careers. But it's also limited in a sense of facility access, what equipment they might have at their house or wherever they're training, and those types of things. But you know, the thing that's really cool to me is that they like it. You know, like it's that simple. In a lot of ways, it's that simple for me. I'd say I wouldn't want to speak for all of them, but I really think that they all enjoy and see the benefit and want to continue the strength and power training. And so that's a huge win early on. And now that that is quote unquote accomplished, I think it just opens more doors to make some more progress and some more headway.
Yeah. Nice, man. Well, you know, I'm going to be keeping up with that journey because I'm beyond curious what that world holds, the triathlon world. Totally foreign to me. So,
well, I'll be picking your brain because I know you do a really good job of quantifying and bringing some metrics in, and I think that's kind of the next step for some of this.
Sure, man.
And as much as I'd like to avoid part 2 of the question, you mentioned the pool stats and the education events that we hold, and that question comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And, how strong, but it usually comes up with kind of speed power athletes, and a lot of different people will have. You'll get some straight answers from some people. You know, 2 times body weight squat is a big one, and then they'll kind of correlate some certain strength measures with speed. And once you get so strong, then you no longer see an improvement in speed and things like that. But I think that's much more challenging in an endurance environment. And so, you know, I really just want to come back to, does the athlete feel strong? Do they feel strong on the bike? Do they feel strong on the run? And if they don't, and it's going to change on different courses and in different environments and situations, but that's all I've really figured out in terms of how to try to understand that side of it.
Yeah.
I think I'm really pleased that they've kind of incorporated me into this role that includes the movement and some of the field-based stuff, because in my mind, it does 2 things. One is it makes sure that I don't get overly caught up on the strength side of things in the weight room, which potentially I could do if that was my sole focus. But when I have the freedom to incorporate the movement stuff, then it becomes more about kind of transferring some of the work that we're doing, whether it be even just movement patterns or application of force or just pure strength, into something a little bit more specific, we'll say. So I think because of that, I think it really helps it to balance out. And it has me sort of thinking, if I look ahead, that it'd be a long time before we ever reach this point of thinking this individual is quote unquote strong enough.
Strong enough. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a really good question. I hope the industry, I have a love-hate relationship with the question. As much as I would love to know like a very specific answer to that question, I think it would also kind of, I would get kind of bored with the industry to some sense.
Yeah,
like one thing
there was a straight answer. Yeah.
Like we don't know what we're doing. We don't.
Yeah.
There's way.
Yeah.
And there's black and white. And
totally individual. Yeah. Totally individual, right? Different types of strength, different types of demands, different types of athletes. But it's fun to try and answer regardless, you know? So.
Oh, it's really good to hear people's answers to that question. And I think it's an important consideration. I think it's something that we should be thinking about. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that we necessarily need to try to find the answer.
Right. Gotcha. Well, dude, I appreciate you popping on here with me. Yeah, man, that was good. We got into some good stuff regarding strength training and triathlon, how strong is strong enough. Got into some mechanics, a little bit of light mechanics work, talked about some elite sprint heroes and what they look like on a day-to-day basis. So if y'all are checking out the video right now on YouTube, I'll label all the portions of the talk we just had so you can go find them at your interest. And then also go check out hettlerperformance.com where you can see Coach Hettler's some of his viewpoints on training, and I kind of give him a follow there on, I believe he's on Twitter. And then if you have any questions, of course, reach out through his website. So I appreciate you joining us, Coach Hettler.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. It's always good to see you.